We've mentioned on a number of occasions that property as an institution, as a system, property rights systems in a society are an ethical institution. They rest on ethical foundations. What we want to do now is look a bit more precisely at exactly what that means. What can we learn from the statement that property is an ethical institution? The most important question there is to ask the question, on what basis does property economics rest? And that helps us to answer this larger question of what we can know about property economics. And it relates to the question of whether or not ethics is a science, how much objective knowledge we can deduce from this, how definite we can be with our critiques of existing systems, really to get it past the idea of simply one opinion or one cultural practice versus another without any really sound way of being able to test them and compare to them. Okay, I've mentioned earlier on that below all of the thinking of customary people is their idea of spirituality, their Genesis story. They see the important thing about their property rights as coming from their story of creation. I will expand that a little to say it's their Genesis story, it's the story of creation, but also their spirituality, and more generally, their understanding of how existence as we know it in the material world works. Now, the study of how existence works is what is studied in the branch of philosophy known as metaphysics. And so the indigenous approach of looking at their property rights as grounded in their understanding of how the world came to be, I will describe as a metaphysical theory or a metaphysical position, a metaphysical belief, whatever we want to call it. So what we have is property economics existing at our advanced level, our high level of society. We don't normally think, like the indigenous people do, of the way that buying and selling land, renting property, maybe organising mining royalties and so on. How does that fit in with metaphysics or our story of creation? We don't do that, but indigenous people do. And so in order to understand a little bit further how to communicate with indigenous people and other cultures relating to property, because this also applies to a certain extent when we deal with Islamic property. And we can see that by looking closely at the Islamic theory that comes ultimately in the Islamic world from the Quran and the Islamic jurisprudence, which goes back hundreds of years of very learned people trying to work out what is right and wrong with various approaches to real estate, to property. Okay, so we have our property system, which is sitting up above everything else, and that's what we do in our day-to-day life as valuers, as property developers, what have you. We can say that all of our doings with property in the economic world has to do with the confidence we have in property title, our property rights. One way or another, we can't have commerce in property unless we have confidence in property title. And that's why something like Torrens Title in Australia is such an important tool, because it makes property economics so much more efficient. And so property title, one way or another, is the foundation, or one of the foundations, one of the important foundations underneath all of our property economics, and really under all economics, because property titles, especially when we expand that to titles to land, labour and capital, is really key in the very foundations of all economics. So we're looking particularly at property, and that gives us a special insight that we can actually apply to economics in general. When we look at something like the Torrens Title, we pretty soon see that the Torrens Title in Australia has developed, it has changed to a certain extent. Other countries use different title systems. Some of them have adopted the Torrens system because it is so efficient, certainly in various parts of Southeast Asia as they've developed. And generally, as that is done, it is done by acts of the government, and it is maintained by the legal system. What we can say, therefore, is that our institution of property is maintained, it's founded on, it's grounded on our government and legal systems. And so if I want to understand property titles in any culture, I can go to their legal system, their system of laws, and their government system usually. And this actually applies to all cultures, not simply our culture or indigenous cultures, but we can apply this approach to better understand property in all cultures, past, across the world, present, perhaps into the future, and maybe even if a Martian came down from outer space, we would be able to talk about property, his spaceship, in terms of how he understands property titles, and that ultimately would probably come down to something that he would understand also in terms of some kind of legal and government system, especially if we understand government as that ordering system for the entire society, for public things. We can ask ourselves, though, what is our law based on? And in fact, on what basis does the government make its laws? A little bit of thought reveals that our laws are intended, in most cases, to reflect what we believe to be just, to be proper, to be fair. And likewise, especially in a democracy, we elect governments who are going to give us just laws, just terms of compensation in the Australian Constitution. The government system is based on this ethical idea of justice. Whenever we use the word justice, we're actually talking ethics. There are a number of words: fair, just, justice, should, which are key words that tell you that when you see one of those words, justice, he should treat somebody with justice, he should do something. The word should is an ethical word. It points to an ethical discourse, some sort of ethical argument. And when we think about it, we can see that all of our laws and all of our government doings are all tested. They're all related in some way to our ethical beliefs, our ethical system. And we've seen already that ethical systems can be made up, at least in part, and often a significant part, on the basis of objectively knowable principles. Our ethics is also closely related to our culture. And where does culture begin and ethics finish, and vice versa? That's a little bit hard to say. That's especially evident when you deal with Indigenous people. Indigenous people will all the time be talking about their laws and customs that come from their Genesis story. And they're very aware that their customs, which gives them the ways that they should and shouldn't do things, in other words, their ethical principles, their ethical practices, come from their customs. And custom and culture, closely related. And law and custom and so on, very closely related. And so are we going to vote for a government or a politician? We're going to vote for someone who we believe is just. Unless we want someone to lead our country who is a robber, maybe because we're robbers too and he's part of our team. I don't know. But generally, we assume that in a democracy, it's a collection of just citizens using their brains, their intellect, to elect just representatives, we would hope. Okay, where does our ethics and our culture come from? When we were looking at property and we started to examine the word property, what does it mean? And those different principles that have to do with land property, what we found was that we had to look at human nature. And we saw there were certain things about human nature that led to conclusions that could be applied as principles to the development of systems of reviewing property rights. What that means is that our ethical system has a lot to do with what we understand humanity to be. In particular, it has to do with our ideas of inclusion and exclusion. In our culture at this point in history, we do not believe in slavery. That's very important, because our understanding of the human person is that every human person, every human being on the planet who either has existed, is existing, or will exist into the future is equal in human dignity, has equal human rights, and so on. We go to a lot of trouble to protect that idea. It's not an idea that is always held within human communities. The ancient Greeks and the Romans, the Americans up until the middle of the 19th century, all were comfortable with slavery. The English were just as comfortable with slavery. They used to have merchants going from Africa, where they would collect black Africans who were free men, and then they'd deliver them for sale into America, North America, where they'd be hopping off the boat as slaves. They'd lost their human dignity between being able to practice their customary culture in Africa to when they were forced to work against their will and really destroy their whole culture and self-respect in the United States. Very ugly, and we're fortunate to be past that. What am I saying here? I'm saying that our culture and our ethical understanding is influenced by our understanding of our anthropology, what it means to be human. We can be critical of former times. We can also claim that our anthropology is somehow informed, it is better, and that means there is some principle to our anthropology which somehow is superior. It must be better, which means it must conform to reality. It must conform to something fundamental and fundamentally knowable about what it is to be human. That comes from our metaphysics and our Genesis story, and we'll get to that shortly. There are some customary people who have rather curious anthropologies. Generally, customary people are of the opinion that there is a qualitative difference between members of the tribe, their own clan, and other people, other humans that look like humans but they're not part of the tribe. And that means that it can extend to property rights, it can extend to fair treatment, it can extend to something as extreme as cannibalism. Certainly theft is often justified amongst tribal people, people that have their culture based on a limited understanding of humanity. And it's something to watch out for, because if you're dealing with somebody who comes from a culture, a tribal group that sees some humans as genuinely having the rights of a human person, usually they're members of that tribe, and others who they're comfortable to use as slaves or as cattle, somehow less human, so they can be abused without any moral culpability. Something to be careful of, and something as you go through your lives to watch out for. As you look at different cultures, different religions even, look at those that treat humanity as a universal equal group of beings, and beware of those that treat humans as some better and some worse. Okay, where does our understanding of anthropology come from? Well, we can see it here on the diagram. That for indigenous people, their understanding of what it is to be human has a lot to do with their creation stories. Marlowe the octopus made the people of the Murray Islands, and he gave them the land. And somehow he made other people who did not belong to the Murray Islands and do not have any rights to the land. And so their understanding of the human person influences their property rights, but it also creates or produces two forms of human, Murray Islanders and others. And we can see the same in Africa and parts of New Guinea, Fiji, all over the world. And so our metaphysics, our Genesis story, our spirituality, does give us our anthropology. Okay, what we see here then is this hierarchy, that the day-to-day doings of property economics, based as it is on property title, based as that is on the legal governmental system, based as it is on culture and ethics, based on anthropology, is ultimately based, in all cases, in all cultures, on their culture's metaphysical understanding of what it is to be, how existence came to be, and that is related very closely to spirituality and a Genesis story. I want to apply this now to a number of particular examples. We're going to look particularly at our culture to begin with, Western property economics. And I'm going to start now basically from the bottom up. Our culture, at this point in history, is based on the assumption that spirituality is irrelevant. If we look closely at our Genesis story, we will find that we teach our children the Genesis story of the Big Bang. In other words, all of what exists in the entire cosmos just exploded out of some tiny little bit of almost nothingness, and it then flourished in all directions as particles spraying out. Eventually those particles, they may have been electrons or protons or whatever, bumped into each other, and from that bumping in of these different particles, clumps were formed that eventually formed up into suns, into planets, into comets, whatever. All of the things in the heavens all came as a result of the random bumping together of these particles which were generated initially from the Big Bang. That Big Bang theory then leads in to the next stage for our anthropology by the system of evolution, or the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution is a theory that would argue that complex systems evolve from simple systems. We don't often see it in practice, but the assumption is that this random banging together of random particles eventually produced complex things like suns and so on out of very simple particles. And on Earth, those particles, those molecules and atoms, bumped together, eventually clumped together, formed living cells. Pretty amazing clumping together. And from those individual cells, they clumped together by randomly rumping into each other and finding it more useful to be together than apart, and produced more and more complex living creatures, our plants and our animals, and ultimately human beings. And so our anthropology is based on the random bumping together of particles and the random aggregation of particles for self-interest, basically. Because a complex creature, say a worm or a beetle or something, is more capable and therefore has a better life, if you like, for its parts than the simple components that it was made from. And by the time we go from a worm or a beetle to something like a mammal, and especially a human, each one of those parts operating together as a result of some random contact in history somewhere gives each one of those parts a better outcome, survival of the fittest. And so our anthropology is based on the idea that humans exist as the random doings of history and physics and chemistry and so on, but without any particular purpose or form, and certainly no particular sense of connection or relationship to other parts of the created world, the existence. I am stressing the individual nature, the way that our Western understanding in science, biology, evolution, Big Bang and so on, all stresses the way that everything that is in existence is there as the result of random collisions. Collisions that might be fortuitous, but they're not necessary. This is a very different anthropology to what you find amongst indigenous people. Customary people see humans as being connected to each other through their tribal relations, and also connected to the land and the rest of creation. Our anthropology is quite different to that approach. Our anthropology can be best described as the understanding of the human person that sees the person as a self-interested, rational individual. Individual because we aren't fundamentally connected. We connect, we form associations for our self-interest. And we do it using our intellect because we're a little bit smarter than dogs and cats and so on, that do things as a result of instinct and need. We do things as a result of perhaps a little bit of cunning added to our instincts and need. That means that our culture and ethics is based on a material understanding of what good means. And if I am nothing more than a bunch of chemistry and electrical impulses, then my material body finds good in those things which are pleasurable, and it finds evil in those things that are not pleasurable, that are uncomfortable, that are painful. And so my culture is based on the idea of freedom, because I need freedom. I fundamentally come from freedom as this random particle or random being that bumps into others on occasions. I should not have any limitations. And because I'm material, it means that my understanding of good ultimately has to do with what pleases me, what feels good, what is pleasurable. And so my culture is a liberal culture based on the maximization of pleasure. And this also informs the principles that I use for ethics. And especially when we look at particular ethical systems, such as utilitarianism, the idea of the greatest good, meaning the greatest quantum of pleasure for the greatest number, is really an expression of this liberalist pleasure maximization, cultural maxim, a maxim. Okay, so that gives us our culture and our ethical principles in our culture, in our civilization. What legal government system does that produce? The curious thing, I find it an amazing thing, is that it actually gives us two possibilities, because liberalist pleasure maximization for self-interested rational individuals can actually be expressed in two ways. On the political left, there is the idea that individuals should be free to be able to pursue their own goals, their own pleasures, with a minimum of inhibition from the rest of the community, and that inhibition will even extend to the inhibiting impact, if you like, of having to work hard, or work at all for that matter, because there's this idea of the radical equality of humanity, which would say that all humans should have equal access to the resources needed for life. And so we have socialism. On the right, we have exactly the same basic principle, but expressed in a different way. The liberalist pleasure maximization would say that we should allow everybody to be able to pursue their own pleasure maximization, their own self-interest, totally uninhibited by the community. And in that way, we're going to end up allowing people the freedom to be able to fully express themselves, to be able to fully realize their potential and so on. And so our community will be happier as a result of allowing everyone to do their own, pursue their own interests with an absolute minimum of community control. So on one side we have the community providing the material needs for the individual so they can personally do whatever they like. On the other side we have the individuals themselves taking that responsibility with the confidence that they'll all end up doing well. In practice, what we find with socialism and capitalism is that on the socialist side, it's usual for not very much to be produced, and so everyone equally shares misery. On the capitalist side, inevitably you find that a very small number of people acquire the economic and political influence to be able to live very, very well, and the majority of the community don't. But they could. It gives us two different approaches to property. State-owned property in the socialist world, especially in communism, and privately owned property, what I will call absolute private property without obligation, and the free market under capitalism. We can refer to the socialist world by the term statism, and often statism is a term which is applied to policies that move towards greater government control, central control, while the free market gives us the potential for that to be avoided. In practice, however, while statism concentrates economic and political power in the hands of the state, the capitalist world tends over time to concentrate especially economic power into the hands of a very small number of large organisations. And if we look, say, at the number of car manufacturers on the planet today, we've probably got a number which is maybe under 20. Considering how many motor cars are made, that's a very small number. And we look at other needs that we have, other consumer goods and so on, and we find likewise there tends to be a shakedown to a very small number of very powerful organisations, which in some cases you'll have private organisations, private corporations, the size of entire countries very often. And there are more than a few large companies whose economies are larger than a number of the smaller companies on the market, on the planet. Okay. So we have two solutions. Statism on the left, free market on the right. And if we look at this, we have these two approaches, and we tend to think that they're the only two approaches that are available. I'm going to contrast the Western approaches, the pair of them, to the indigenous approach, different culture. We've seen that their genesis story is based on the idea that there is some supernatural agency that has created from nothing all of the world and everything in it, including the people. And because everything that was created by this intelligent supernatural agency, who then gave the customs and laws to the people, gave them customs and laws as a group, and created them as a group with necessary connections. Customary people always have an idea, an anthropology, that in some ways includes far more connectedness. Now, we've noted that indigenous people often have this human connectedness amongst their own people, amongst their clan, amongst their tribe, or their family, but a radical gap, a break, a disjuncture between those connected people and all the rest. Anyone who's not part of the tribe is somehow totally different, totally disconnected. And so you've got an anthropology in indigenous communities very often, which doesn't respect the universal dignity of humanity, but it does have a high level of connectedness in their understanding of what it is to be human. That leads to an approach to humanity, at least the humanity that count amongst indigenous people, is that people belong to a clan. They belong to something. Everyone belongs to somebody else. And you'll find that dealing with indigenous people, very often genealogies are very important. In other words, you talk to someone and they will be telling you who their ancestors were and so on. And when they talk to each other, they will be tracking back through their respective family trees and so on, because this connection through the family tree is very important. We see it in other parts of the world as well. I find that one of the impressive things about the Chinese culture is the respect in traditional Chinese culture for ancestors, to the extent that a Chinese person will often, and certainly traditionally, will tell you their family name before their personal name, which is the opposite to the Western, the European practice of putting the personal name first. Out of respect for one's ancestors, a Chinese person will refer to themselves by their family name and then only secondarily by their personal name. This sense of belonging is very, very strong. If people exist as part of a unit, part of a larger group, a clan or a tribe, it produces a culture that has a collective or a communal focus. And so the collective, the community, the tribe, the clan, is the real focus of attention for one's effort, for one's sense of worth. And so people in indigenous cultures will tend to see themselves as noble, as worthwhile, not in terms of their personal bank account, but in terms of their contribution to their society, to their tribe. They will see themselves as bringing honour to their tribe, more than honour to themselves. And their honour to themselves is partly, in fact largely, determined by how much honour they bring their clan. And so they define themselves with respect to their clan, whereas Westerners, especially these days, define themselves purely in terms of themselves, and only secondarily will they, in some cases, tell you their family name. One of the curiosities about Western people is that, especially at our part of history, younger people especially, are almost forgetting that they come from families. And you notice this when you introduce people. It wasn't so long ago that you would introduce people as John Smith or Billy Jones or what have you. Now people tend to introduce each other as saying, well, this is Bill, this is Bob, this is Sue, this is Sally. The family names are becoming irrelevant because we're pursuing more and more this individual culture, which is separated from any real connection to clan, family, and so on. For indigenous people, this is really quite horrid. And so to lose your connection to your clan is to be considered to be really a traitor to your people. Now what this means is that the culture and ethics has a strong sense of serve and you will be served. That your material support, your ethical support, your status in the community is all in terms of how effectively you bring honour and material rewards to your society. And so if you're out there as a better hunter in a hunter and gatherer society, that means that you are respected as a good man or as a good hunter because of what you bring to the community, not necessarily because of what you are yourself. Serve and you will be served. Now from that ethic comes a different approach to government and law. Laws tend to be passed down by custom, and government tends to be done far more on a clan or a tribe basis. And so the allocation of roles no longer needs to be, say, democratic, as in our situation where we're individuals all clumping together to vote for a just leader. In indigenous communities, the traditional leaders are often the patriarchs or the members of the chiefly families or what have you. There's some sense of order and respect because it's understood that those who lead the community do it as an obligation to the community, not as an opportunity to exploit the community, which is totally different to our cultural approach. From the idea of family and clan government and the other more fundamental ideas comes the idea of perpetual clan property. And from that, the idea that property wealth is there as a resource for the community. And now that we can see what the indigenous people's thinking is based on, level by level by level, as we go down deeper and deeper and deeper, we can see why it is supremely logical. It follows very obviously for the approach that indigenous people use for their property. That can be contrasted to the Western approach, which is radically different. We use property really to get benefits at other people's expense. We want to maximise our rent. We want to maximise the realisation from our development. Now, maximisation of our realisation comes as the result of charging somebody else a price which could be quite inconvenient for them. It's certainly often not the kind of price that you would charge somebody that you were really close to or fond of or had respect for. So a completely different approach to property economics. One approach sees the individual as obtaining a well-being as a result of their action towards community interest. And so by serving the community, they're confident that they will be served adequately themselves. On the other hand, in the West, we believe that community well-being will come through individual self-interest. So if we have a community of people who are all there individually maximising their profits and working hard to beat the market and so on, then we believe that that will give us the ideal solution, either in a statist or a free market type of society. That gives us pretty much the foundations, the hierarchy. And we can see that the options for culture are a lot more varied than simply the political left or the political right. And Indigenous people tend to provide us this reference point, this independent review of what very often we consider to be sort of fixed and total. There's a lot more available than simply the ideological left or the ideological right. I'm going to use these same ideas and present them in a slightly different way. I'm going to talk about what I'll call the dimensions of human action. Western thinking tends to consider that the possibilities for human action, social action, political action and so on, lies on a unidimensional line between left and right. I'm either a left-winger, I believe in statism, or I'm a right-winger, I believe in free enterprise, or I'm some kind of a muddy mix of the two, somewhere in the middle. And I will meet people and I will try to identify what side of that one line, bit on the left, bit on the right, a long way on the left, long way on the right, far left, and so on. Because in my culture, in the Western culture, that's the only dimension of human action, this left-right divide. However, we can see that some cultures don't fit, and so to understand them we have to put in some extra dimensions. Let's review how this works. We'll begin by considering what I will call the institutional dimension. And I use that as a term merely to give me the options of the left or the right. State control on the left, leading to socialism, or self-control on the right, leading to capitalism. As I say, often we tend to think that they are the only possibilities. They're certainly the only Western possibilities. And a lot of Western thinkers try their hardest to put Indigenous people into this Western framework. Usually it doesn't work very well, because they don't have this extra dimension of understanding of what goes into a culture that is really very different between the West and Indigenous people. What are these extra dimensions? Well, the next dimension I want to look at, running across here in the blue, I'm going to call the anthropological dimension. Before we get to that, we'll just look a little bit at what we can learn from capitalism and socialism. When we look at these two alternatives, one of the things that any socialist will tell you is all of the fairly recognisable and I would say objective shortcomings of capitalism. Capitalism, when it's given free rein, tends to result in polarisation of wealth. We're seeing that over the last 50 years or so in Western economies. We've seen it over the longer history, this side of about the year 1500. The polarisation of wealth tended to be reduced a little bit towards the end of the 19th century as a result of the threat of socialism. But generally, if capitalism is left to itself, we end up with the polarisation of wealth. Capitalism is also associated with pauperisation, the tendency for large numbers of the community to be made extremely poor, while a very small number of people in a capitalist society tend to become very, very wealthy. The Occupy movement, which is now really no more than history, but was an attempt to draw attention to the paupers in society, when American college students and university graduates who could see that they graduated from university having a lot of education and a lot of debt, but very poor employment opportunities, realised that they were facing poverty. In fact, for about someone maybe sort of 22, 25 years old, to be starting life without a job but with a huge debt, they were considerably behind where their parents or grandparents were at a similar part of their life. So somehow we're now moving into a situation where in capitalist countries, young people especially are experiencing pauperisation in a level that hasn't been seen in at least a century. We move now across to socialism, and we see that socialism also has its downsides. When socialism is allowed to have full reign, it tends to frustrate incentives. There's no point in working hard if your pay packet is going to be the same rain, hail or shine. And in fact, if the government owns everything and you really have great need, there's a tendency to cheat along the edges and maybe steal from the government. There are a number of places where socialism is extremely antisocial, and it certainly is not very successful economically, and because it's not very effective as a motivator, especially in its absence of private property or adequate private property. And so we've got both capitalism and socialism not quite doing the job. We need something else. The indigenous people come in and provide an alternative on what I'm going to call, or have called, the anthropological dimension. That dimension also has two major possibilities and perhaps some extras as well. We've already noted that our Western culture, be it left or right, are both based on the idea of material individualism, the idea that humans are no more than flesh and blood and chemistry and whatnot, and we're not in any way particularly connected. So we're individualists and we're also material. But there are other approaches to the question of anthropology, and this is the idea that people are connected fundamentally. I'm going to refer to this by a rather awkward title. I'm going to call it solidarism, coming from the word solid, in other words, all one piece. It's an awkward word, but it does describe the idea that I want to communicate. When we look at the indigenous people today, but also the ancients at the time of their cultural ascendancy, we saw a high level of solidarity. And that word solidarity was used by the Polish trade union in order to break up communist Russia. And it showed that people were willing to work together. And even though socialism is supposed to be, the community of workers all uniting to overthrow the ruling classes and all of that carry on, it's not really solidarist, as we saw with those Polish workers. They believed in standing together shoulder by shoulder and being prepared to suffer and fight and so on for what they believed in. We saw similar examples of solidarity in the 19th century in England, and we certainly see it as those places where humans do probably the most impressive and courageous things, where people do things for their community, for their country, for their family back home or what have you. And we see it with the indigenous people or the ancients. However, before we wax lyric too much on the merits of solidarism in culture, we should also look at the downsides. When we look at indigenous people, we find that as a group, they tend to stop work once their bellies are full, once they're comfortable. And so I'll describe that as the problem of early satisficing. In other words, situations where people do what needs to be done and then stop. They're not really motivated to go any further. They're not going to be building rocket ships to the moon or what have you, because they're too busy sitting under a tree and telling stories and singing songs and whatnot. Now, whether that's better or not, I don't know. I think I would prefer to live in a country where I can get my teeth fixed or my surgery done if I need those things. Modern medicine is very comforting thing to know that you have available. You don't tend to find modern medicine native to indigenous communities. The West has been far more effective at providing those sorts of things. So this early satisfying character of indigenous people is not especially useful. Close related to that, and really what I've been describing, is a disinterest in science. And so we see at least three possibilities, and all of them have their downsides. I'm not saying all of them necessarily are bad, it's just that none of them are absolutely perfect. Some have been better than the others. One example of a solidarist community would be the community of the Middle Ages, which when we studied that group, we could see that it was fundamentally solidarist, but they did have an interest in science. And there was a motivation to excellence in activity, in the flourishing of the arts and technology and so on. And we saw beautiful art, impressive improvements in science and technology and so on through the Middle Ages, and especially the High Middle Ages, the medieval period and so on. So it's possible for solidarism to overcome those latent shortcomings, but it needs something else. And this leads us to our third dimension, which we're going to refer to as the spiritual dimension. Here we're going to be looking at the possibilities of what kind of spirituality is behind more or less successful people. We're going to suggest that there are three possibilities in the spiritual dimension. There's the usual expectation of a positive deity, a creator spirit who is friendly, who is beneficial to the people, but we also have to recognize that from time to time spiritualities grow up which we could call negative. The human sacrifice in the Aztecs suggested a vengeful, fearful deity, not a very pleasant creature to be around or being to be around. Likewise, voodoo in Africa, or perhaps Kali worship in India. We see examples of this kind of evil deity in almost all parts of the world, and that gives us a different dimension. I guess Satanism in the West could be considered as the worship of a negative deity. So here we have three dimensions. There may be more dimensions, we could possibly add others, but these tend to capture many of the most important qualities, most important principles and dimensions of principles that can be used to understand different cultures. And by using them, we can understand cultures by stepping out of our own quite genuinely. Because too often, cultural studies is done on the basis of trying to squeeze other cultures into the left-right possibilities of modern Western thinking. It doesn't work. What I want to do now is provide a different type of summary based on the three dimensions that we have just been considering. I'm going to work here from the left to the right. I'm going to look at the way that different possibilities for the spiritual or Genesis story options lead into different anthropologies, and they then support different approaches to government, property, social doings, economics, and so on. We've noticed that there are three possibilities in the spiritual dimension. A positive deity, a neutral middle position where you don't take any interest in spiritual things, which is something close to our current culture, or a negative deity where I might be a Kali worshipper, a Thagi in India, a Aztec doing human sacrifice or something. Let's look at what that leads to. If my culture is based on a positive deity, the idea that the world and everyone in it is made by a God who is good and who fosters goodness, expects goodness, wants to encourage goodness amongst his people, it will produce a culture that also respects honesty, respect, and care for others, what we will call generally charity. If we take the spiritual dimension into its neutral position, either positive or negative, neither positive nor negative, and we say, well, there's no need to be concerned about the spiritual dimension for our daily living, we will have a individualist culture, perhaps similar to our own, but also the individualism of late Greece and late Rome. We'll have a materialist perspective where the only good tends to be material good, comforts, pleasures and so on. When it comes to ethics, it becomes a little bit tricky, because when we teach professional ethics and professionalism and so on, we try to encourage students into the idea of believing that honesty is a good idea. We usually say that honesty is a good idea because you'll be more successful as a businessman and so on, or your professional life will be easier and more comfortable, more profitable. But a little reflection will show you or reveal to you that the most effective person in a generally honest society is the person who knows how to look honest while being extremely good at being dishonest. This is pretty much your Machiavellian prince. This would suggest that while honesty pays, and sometimes it pays modestly well, dishonesty often pays considerably better with a lot less work, especially if you're good at being a slick, dishonest person. And so it leaves us with a bit of a difficulty when it comes to teaching ethics when we come from an individualist, materialist world. When we look at the negative deity, we see something which, at least from a distance, is not particularly attractive, where we see the other is for exploitation, to eat them if I was a cannibal. The other might be someone who I will strangle as part of my religious obligations as a Thuggee worshipping Kali in India. Or perhaps I will kill them and offer them, burn them, or perhaps torture them to death as the Aztecs used to. It's a situation where the other is for exploitation. If you think about what this means in the marketplace, if you go into a marketplace where the person that you're doing business with is worshipping a negative deity, give a little bit of thought as to what kind of fair result you're going to get as a result of that commercial relationship. You'll have to be very, very careful because you might end up on the menu or something. Let's move now to looking at how these three possibilities express themselves in terms of culture. We've seen that enduring customary peoples, in other words, the customary peoples that we find today that still practice their traditions and customs, tend to, by and large, have a positive idea, a positive view of their gods. The gods are generally good, and they've given them laws that are good and effective and so on. We also find this sort of underlying principle existing in other ancient civilizations such as early Rome, early Greece, pre-modern Europe, so medieval period. We also see it if we look closely at other parts of the world, especially in China, where at various times, probably more as a philosophical system than as a spiritual system, but when their philosophy, whether it's Buddhism or ancestor worship and so on, is organized towards goodness and honor, the culture tends to grow. The agnostic position in the middle, where spirituality is irrelevant, is very evident, especially for socialism, which is aggressively against any spiritual belief. You also find it underlying capitalism, especially mature capitalism. We see it in ancient cultures such as late Rome, also late Greece, and to a certain extent different periods in China and India in their periods or ancient periods of cultural strength. We find that the negative deity can support cultures that are moderately successful, in fact in some cases very successful. And so the Phoenicians in Carthage had a very successful maritime empire, even though they practiced human sacrifice, infant sacrifice in that case. The Aztecs ran an empire in South America, again on the basis of a spirituality that was very exploitative. And likewise the Thuggees, but perhaps a less successful culturally. Okay, let's move to some conclusions. The first and most obvious is that apart from now having a framework that we can use to look at any culture, and any culture, I think, with a certain degree of insight and respect, but we can certainly see that the left-right dichotomy, the idea of a single possibility for human action, is really quite outdated. We really need our property economics to take account of more than merely our modern Western perspective, especially when we interact with Western people, because there are benefits and strengths that can come from non-Western cultures. It might be timely for those to be moving into the Western understanding. We certainly see that in the case of environmental legislation, where there is a growing concern for justice across generations, which has been rather lacking in the past, but we can certainly see strong parallels with the way that customary people have this strong sense of caring for their land resources so that it can be available for their children, their grandchildren, and their grandchildren's grandchildren. Lastly, the challenge of customary tenure is really not an awkward inconvenience to be overcome, but rather it's an opportunity for our understanding of how we do economics, and particularly property economics, to meaningfully move forward and to learn how to approach the questions of property and property institutions in a way which is going to be more effective into the future. So hopefully this framework you will find useful in understanding your world, and especially for stepping outside of the limitations of our own culture, because there's really no point in being some kind of a cultural bully where we don't take adequate account of the merits of other cultures.